November 24, 1944, 30,000 feet above Tokyo, the silver skin of B-29 Superfortress No. 426274 reflected the morning sun as it led a formation of 111 bombers toward the Japanese capital. Inside the pressurized cabin, First Lieutenant Robert Fling adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon through the bombardier's station in the aircraft's nose. Below him, somewhere beyond the clouds, lay the Musashino aircraft plant, their primary target for this historic mission. This was the first American bombing raid on Tokyo since Jimmy Doolittle's audacious carrier-launched strike 2 years earlier. But unlike that symbolic gesture of 16 medium bombers, this was industrial warfare delivered from an altitude Japanese fighters could barely reach. 3 months earlier, Japanese intelligence officers had stood on the tarmac at an airfield on Iwo Jima, reviewing reconnaissance photographs of American construction activity in the Mariana Islands. The images showed massive runways being extended, hard stands multiplying across former sugarcane fields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The implications were unmistakable. The Americans were preparing bases for a new bomber, one capable of reaching the Japanese home islands with payloads that would dwarf anything seen before. Imperial General Headquarters was deeply concerned, but many Japanese pilots and military leaders remained confident. They had faced American bombers before in China and over Southeast Asia. Yes, this B-29 was larger, flew higher, moved faster. But it was still just an airplane, still vulnerable to cannon fire, still dependent on engines that could be set aflame. The conventional wisdom among Japanese fighter pilots was clear. Get above the bombers, dive through the formation with guns blazing, and the silver giants would fall from the sky like any other aircraft. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The confidence was not entirely misplaced. Japanese pilots were among the most experienced in the world, veterans of campaigns across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. They flew aircraft like the Mitsubishi A6M0, legendary for its maneuverability, the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony Interceptor, the Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo, specifically designed for high-altitude interception with an astonishing rate of climb. These were capable machines, flown by skilled men who had faced combat for years. What the Japanese military did not fully comprehend in those autumn months of 1944 was the magnitude of what was approaching. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented a technological leap so profound that it would redefine strategic bombing and render conventional air defense doctrine obsolete. The aircraft had been designed in the late 1930s as America prepared for the possibility of global war. Boeing's engineers had created something extraordinary. A bomber with a 141-foot wingspan, powered by 4 massive Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower and equipped with turbochargers. The B-29 featured a pressurized cabin, allowing the crew to operate comfortably at altitudes above 30,000 feet. It carried an analog computer-controlled fire control system that allowed gunners to direct 5 remote machine gun turrets, each armed with twin Browning 50 caliber machine guns. The tail turret added a 20mm cannon. The bomber could carry up to 20,000 pounds of ordnance over distances exceeding 3,000 miles. The development program had cost $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project, making it the single most expensive military project of the Second World War. Getting the Superfortress into combat had been an ordeal. The completion aircraft incorporated so many advanced features, each pushing the boundaries of contemporary technology, that it suffered from an unprecedented number of teething problems. Engines overheated, electrical systems failed, the remote gun turrets malfunctioned, production delays mounted as engineers struggled to resolve issue after issue. General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of the United States Army Air Forces, had personally driven the program forward with relentless urgency. He understood that strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands was essential to victory, and only the B-29 possessed the range and payload capacity to deliver it. In March 1944, Arnold visited Pratt Army Airfield in Kansas to inspect the bomber wing preparing for deployment. he found not a single B-29 ready for combat operations. Furious, Arnold launched what became known as the Battle of Kansas, a desperate push to get the bombers combat ready. Workers and mechanics labored around the clock. Modifications were rushed through. Training accelerated. By early summer 1944, the first operational B-29 seconds were finally ready. They would initially deploy to the China-Burma-India theatre under Operation Matterhorn, an ambitious but logistically nightmarish plan to base the bombers in India while staging through forward airfields around Chengdu in China. On June 5, 1944, Brigadier General Kenneth Wolfe launched the first B-29 combat mission against Japanese railroad facilities in Bangkok, Thailand. The mission revealed both the bomber's potential and its problems. Of 112 superfortresses prepared, only 98 managed to take off. One crashed immediately. Weather caused assembly problems. Nevertheless, the B-29 seconds reached their target and demonstrated they could penetrate defended airspace that would have been suicidal for other bombers. On June 15, 1944, came the mission Japanese leaders had been dreading. 68 B-29 seconds took off from Chinese bases for a strike on the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata, on the Japanese home island of Kyushu. This was the first American bombing raid on Japan proper since the Doolittle raid. The raid achieved limited physical damage. Only 47 bombers hit the target area, dropping approximately 107 tons of bombs. One B-29 was shot down by Japanese fighters, but the psychological impact was immense. American bombers had reached Japan. The home islands were no longer a sanctuary. For Japanese civilians who had been assured of their invulnerability, the sight and sound of American bombers overhead shattered that comforting illusion. For Japanese military planners, the raid confirmed their worst fears. The Americans now possessed the capability to strike at will against the industrial heart of the empire. The Japanese response was immediate. Fighter strength in western Japan was reinforced. Anti-aircraft batteries proliferated around major cities and industrial complexes. Searchlight units were deployed. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force established new interceptor squadrons specifically tasked with home defense. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1944, B-29 seconds from Chinese bases conducted sporadic raids on targets in Japan and Japanese-occupied territory. Results were mixed. The logistical challenges of operating from China proved nearly insurmountable. Every gallon of aviation fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to be flown over the Himalayan hump from India to China. It required 12 B-29 supply flights to generate enough fuel and ordnance for a single combat mission to Japan. Japanese forces in China, recognizing the threat, launched ground offensives against the American forward airfields. Meanwhile, Japanese interceptor pilots were gaining experience in the specific challenges of engaging the B-29. The bomber flew at altitudes many Japanese fighters struggled to reach. At 30,000 feet, the thin air strangled engine performance. Fighters that were nimble and deadly at lower altitudes became sluggish, their engines gasping for oxygen. Closing speed was another challenge. The B-29 cruised at approximately 220 miles per hour at high altitude. When American pilots detected incoming fighters, they could push their aircraft into a shallow dive, accelerating to over 300 miles per hour. Japanese interceptors attempting to chase from behind found themselves in a futile pursuit, burning fuel without closing the distance. The only effective tactic was a head-on attack, positioning fighters above and ahead of the bomber formation, then diving through with guns blazing. But executing this maneuver required precise positioning, split-second timing, and extraordinary courage. The combined closing speed exceeded 600 miles per hour. Pilots had perhaps 2 seconds to aim and fire before hurtling past their target, the B-29's. Defensive armament made these attacks even more dangerous. The remote-controlled gun turrets could track and engage fighters from multiple angles. 50-caliber machine guns had effective range and devastating hitting power. Japanese pilots discovered that their lighter aircraft, optimized for maneuverability over protection, were vulnerable to the heavy American guns. A single 50 caliber round through the engine or fuel tank could doom an interceptor. Some Japanese units resorted to ramming attacks. Pilots would deliberately collide with B-29 seconds, sacrificing their own lives to destroy the bomber. On December 3, 1944, the 244th Sentai, an elite interceptor unit defending Tokyo, conducted a coordinated ramming attack. 6 B-29 seconds were claimed destroyed in a single sortie, with all attacking pilots reportedly surviving by parachute. Whether these ramming attacks were truly successful or represented exaggerated claims remains debated by historians, but they demonstrated the desperation of Japanese tactics. By October 1944, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. American forces had captured the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, located only 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. These islands provided everything the China bases lacked: deep water harbors for supply ships, ample space for massive airfield construction, no need to fly supplies over mountains or worry about Japanese ground offensives. Within weeks, construction battalions transformed the islands. Runways stretched for thousands of feet across former jungle and sugarcane fields. Hardstands and taxiways proliferated. Quonset huts and tent cities housed thousands of personnel. By late November 1944, over 100 B-29 seconds sat on Saipan alone. The 21st Bomber Command, under Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, prepared for the campaign that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. The first mission from Marianas was a shakedown raid against the Japanese-held island of Truk on October 27, 1944. 18 bombers launched, 4 experienced mechanical problems and turned back. The remaining 14 attacked from high altitude with modest results. It was practice, a rehearsal for what was coming. On November 24, 1944, the real campaign began. The target was the Musashino aircraft plant on the outskirts of Tokyo, one of Japan's most important industrial facilities. 111 B-29 seconds took off from Saipan that morning. The mission commander, Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell, flew as command pilot aboard the lead aircraft, B-29 Dauntless Dottie. The formation climbed to altitude and set course for Japan. The flight took approximately 6 hours. Crews monitored engine temperatures, watching for the overheating problems that plagued the R-3350 engines. Navigators calculated drift and wind correction. Radio operators maintained communication with base. Gunners test-fired their weapons and scanned for fighters. As the Japanese coastline appeared on the horizon, tension rose. The bombardiers prepared their Norden bomb sites. This was the moment all their training had been building toward. The first major American raid on Tokyo since Doolittle. The announcement to Japan and the world that American strategic air power now dominated the skies over the home islands. Japanese defenders detected the incoming formation. Air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo. Civilians scrambled for shelters. Interceptor squadrons launched from airfields around the capital. Approximately 125 Japanese fighters rose to meet the bombers. The Tokyo Air Defense System, under the command of the 10th Flying Division, controlled 210 fighters distributed across airfields throughout the region. It was an impressive force on paper, but it faced a nearly impossible task. The B-29 seconds were approaching at altitudes above 30,000 feet. Many Japanese fighters could not reach this height. Those that did arrived with engines straining, maneuverability compromised, pilots struggling with oxygen deprivation. The American formation maintained tight cohesion, each bomber positioned to provide mutual defensive fire support. As the first Japanese fighters closed for attack, the sky erupted with tracer fire. 50 caliber machine guns hammered out defensive fire. B-29 gunners, trained extensively in formation defense, engaged targets with disciplined fire. Japanese pilots pressed attacks with remarkable courage, diving through the formation despite the storm of defensive fire. But the combination of high altitude, closing speed, and defensive armament made effective attacks extraordinarily difficult. The bomber formation reached Tokyo. Below them, the city sprawled across the landscape, a vast urban expanse that had grown massively during decades of industrialization. Weather conditions were poor. Cloud cover obscured much of the target area. Of the 111 B-29 seconds that had launched, only 24 managed to bomb the primary target at Musashino. The others attacked port facilities and secondary targets through clouds using radar bombing techniques. Results were disappointing from a military standpoint. Post-strike reconnaissance showed minimal damage to the Musashino plant. The precision bombing doctrine that worked in Europe was proving ineffective over Japan. But the mission accomplished something far more significant than physical destruction. It demonstrated American capability and Japanese vulnerability. The superfortresses had flown to Tokyo, the very heart of the empire, dropped their bombs, and returned to their bases. Only one B-29 was shot down despite facing over 100 fighters and extensive anti-aircraft fire. For the Japanese people who watched this spectacle, the implications were terrifying. American bombers could reach them with impunity. The vaunted Japanese air defense system had failed to stop them. The homeland was no longer safe. For Japanese military leaders, the raid confirmed what intelligence assessments had been warning. The Americans possessed a strategic bombing capability that Japanese air defenses were structurally incapable of countering. The fundamental problem was technological. Japanese fighters had been designed for different missions, optimized for low and medium altitude combat, emphasizing maneuverability over high-altitude performance. Engines lacked the supercharging necessary for sustained high-altitude operations. Armament was often insufficient to inflict critical damage on the heavily built American bombers quickly enough. Defensive fire from B-29 formations inflicted unsustainable casualties on attacking fighters. The strategic implications extended beyond tactical air combat. Japan's industrial infrastructure was now exposed to systematic destruction. The factories producing aircraft, engines, and weapons needed to continue the war could be bombed with increasing frequency and intensity. The dispersed nature of Japanese manufacturing, with many components produced in small workshops scattered through residential areas, made defense even more difficult. You could not concentrate anti-aircraft defenses and fighters when targets were everywhere. In the weeks following the November 24th raid, B-29 seconds returned to Tokyo and other Japanese cities with increasing regularity. Each mission revealed the same pattern. Bombers approached at high altitude. Japanese fighters struggled to intercept effectively. Defensive fire from the bomber formations proved devastating. Physical damage to specific targets remained limited due to weather, the jet stream, and the challenges of precision bombing from extreme altitude. But the psychological and strategic effects were profound. Japanese civilians lived in growing fear as air raid sirens became a regular feature of daily life. Production in factories decreased as workers spent time in shelters rather than at their workstations. The Japanese government's propaganda machine struggled to maintain morale. How could they explain that American bombers were systematically attacking Japanese cities while Japanese fighters seemed unable to stop them? Japanese fighter pilots were not cowards. They fought with extraordinary bravery, pressing attacks despite overwhelming odds. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi, commander of the 244th Sentai, became renowned as one of Japan's most successful B-29 interceptors. His unit practiced night formation flying, unusual for home defense fighters, allowing them to conduct night interceptions. On December 3, 1944, Kobayashi shot down his first B-29. His unit would be credited with multiple Superfortress kills through the remaining months of the war, often employing ramming tactics when conventional attacks failed. But individual heroism could not compensate for systemic disadvantages. By January 1945, 21st Bomber Command had dropped only 1,500 tons of bombs on Japan. Accuracy remained poor. On half the missions, only one bomb in 50 fell within 1,000 feet of the aim point. General Arnold was dissatisfied. The massive investment in the B-29 program was not producing the results he had promised. Major General Curtis LeMay, who had commanded B-29 operations from China with somewhat better results, was transferred to Guam to take command of 21st Bomber Command in January 1945. LeMay was a hard-driving commander, known for innovative tactics and ruthless efficiency. He immediately analyzed the problems plaguing the precision bombing campaign. High winds at altitude, specifically the jet stream, scattered bombs unpredictably. Cloud cover over Japan was frequent, preventing visual bombing. Japanese manufacturing was dispersed through urban areas rather than concentrated in large factories like in Germany. Defensive losses, while not catastrophic, were concerning. LeMay made tactical adjustments. He lowered bombing altitudes by several thousand feet to reduce jet stream effects and extend range. He experimented with different approaches and formations. But the fundamental problem remained. High-altitude precision bombing was not working against Japan. Meanwhile, intelligence analysts were reaching their own conclusions. Unlike Germany, where industry was concentrated in large factory complexes that made ideal targets for precision bombing, Japanese manufacturing was organized differently. In Tokyo, half of all workers were employed in factories of fewer than 100 people. Critical components were produced in small workshops scattered throughout residential neighborhoods. Destroying Japanese war production would require destroying Japanese cities. This realization coincided with the availability of massive stockpiles of incendiary bombs in the Marianas. The M69 incendiary bomb, filled with napalm, had proven highly effective in tests against Japanese-style wooden structures at the WWII Proving Ground in Utah. Arnold and the air staff had been accumulating incendiaries for months, waiting for the right moment to launch a comprehensive firebombing campaign. A test incendiary raid against Kobe on February 4, 1945, achieved remarkable results. 1,039 buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. Another incendiary attack on Tokyo on February 25 destroyed approximately 1 square mile of urban area and over 28,000 buildings, despite cloud cover forcing radar bombing. The success of these raids convinced LeMay and the 20th Air Force leadership that incendiary attacks against Japanese cities would be far more effective than continued attempts at precision bombing. In early March 1945, LeMay made a radical decision that would transform the air war over Japan. He would abandon high-altitude daylight precision bombing entirely. Instead, he would send his B-29 seconds against Japanese cities at night, flying at low altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, stripped of most defensive armament to maximize bomb load capacity. The tactic was revolutionary and risky. Everything the United States Army Air Forces had taught about strategic bombing for 2 decades emphasized high-altitude daylight precision attacks. Bomber advocates like General Billy Mitchell and the theorists at the Air Corps Tactical School had built doctrine around the idea that bombers operating at high altitude could penetrate enemy defenses, destroy specific military and industrial targets with precision, and force enemy surrender without the need for costly ground invasions. LeMay was about to throw all of that doctrine away. He believed Japanese night defenses were weak. Intelligence reports indicated few effective night fighters and limited searchlight coverage. Japanese heavy anti-aircraft guns had optimal ranges above the altitudes where B-29 seconds would be flying. Lighter anti-aircraft weapons were most effective below those altitudes. There was, potentially, a sweet spot where the bombers would be relatively safe. Flying at lower altitudes would reduce fuel consumption, allowing the bombers to carry much larger bomb loads. Removing defensive guns and gunners would further increase payload capacity. Each B-29 could carry up to 7 tons of incendiaries instead of the 3 tons of high explosives they had been delivering in precision raids. LeMay shared his plan with only his most senior commanders. The crews who would fly the mission were kept in the dark until briefing time. On the afternoon of March 9, 1945, as Chamorro Standard Time clocks in the Marianas showed 10:30 in the morning, crews began assembling for briefing. When they learned the mission parameters, they were stunned. Low altitude, night attack. Guns removed except for tail turrets. The target was Tokyo. 334 B-29 seconds would participate. Pathfinder aircraft would go in first, marking the target area with napalm bombs in a giant X pattern across the densely populated working-class district near the docks. Follow-on waves would saturate the marked area with incendiaries. The objective was not to hit a specific factory. The objective was to burn Tokyo to the ground. Operation Meeting House was about to begin. As darkness fell over the Mariana Islands on the evening of March 9, 1945, ground crews completed their final preparations. 346 B-29 Superfortresses sat on runways across Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, each loaded with tons of incendiary bombs. The 73rd Bombardment Wing contributed 169 aircraft from Saipan. The 313th Bombardment Wing added 121 bombers, also from Saipan. The 314th Bombardment Wing, newly arrived on Guam, provided 56 aircraft. The bombers scheduled to arrive over Tokyo first carried M47 incendiary bombs, weapons using napalm capable of starting fires that required mechanized firefighting equipment to control. Aircraft in later waves were loaded with clusters of M69 incendiaries. Each E-46 cluster bomb would explode at 2,500 feet altitude, releasing 38 individual M69 bomblets. Each bomblet contained napalm that would ignite 3 to 5 seconds after impact, spraying a jet of flaming gel that stuck to everything it touched and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. The 73rd and 313th Bombardment Wing's aircraft each carried 7 tons of bombs. The 314th Wing's bombers, flying from Guam, would travel a greater distance and therefore carried 5 tons each. It was the largest bomb-load American strategic bombers had ever carried on a single mission. At 5:35 local time, the first B-29 seconds began their takeoff rolls. It took 2 hours and 45 minutes for all 325 bombers that would actually launch to get airborne. 21 aircraft aborted due to mechanical problems before takeoff. The formation set course for Japan, 1,500 miles to the north. Aboard the bombers, crews settled into the long flight. Radio operator Staff Sergeant Richard Barthold sat in his cramped station, pressed against the partition separating him from the flight engineer, the rattling of the upper turret's 50 caliber machine guns vibrating against his head. Across from him, the navigator faced forward, continuously calculating their position. The flight engineer faced aft, monitoring engine instruments. The mood was tense. Everyone understood this mission was different. Flying at low altitude made them vulnerable in ways they had never been before. But it also meant they would carry enough incendiaries to potentially destroy a significant portion of Tokyo. If the mission succeeded, it could shorten the war. If it failed, losses might be catastrophic. As the formation approached Japan, weather conditions were favorable. Cloud cover was minimal, visibility was good. The first crews to arrive over Tokyo would be able to see clearly for 10 miles. On the ground, conditions were cold and windy, with gusts blowing from the southeast at speeds between 45 and 67 miles per hour. These strong winds would prove critical to what was about to unfold. The first B-29 seconds over Tokyo were 4 Pathfinder aircraft tasked with marking the target. They arrived over the city shortly before midnight on March 9th. Flying in crossing patterns, they dropped their loads of M47 napalm bombs at 50-foot intervals, creating a giant flaming X across the heart of the Shitamachi district, the densely populated working-class neighborhood, near the docks in Koto and Chuo wards on the east side of the city. Tokyo's defenders had been expecting an attack, but they had not detected the American force until it arrived directly over the city. The Japanese radar and early warning system, never as sophisticated as German or British systems, had failed to provide adequate warning. When the bombers appeared, the response was confused and uncoordinated. Interceptor squadrons scrambled from airfields around Tokyo, but the pilots received little direction from ground controllers. Fighter flights were not coordinated with searchlight and anti-aircraft batteries. Japanese fighters prowled the coast and the approaches to the city, but without guidance from ground radar, they never made contact with the bomber stream. The vast majority of American crews would report seeing no enemy fighters throughout the entire mission. The Japanese Army's anti-aircraft gun batteries around Tokyo faced a different problem. They had prepared and trained to engage bombers at high altitude, typically above 20,000 feet. The American tactics manuals captured earlier in the war all emphasized high-altitude operations. Every B-29 raid up until this night had come in above 25,000 feet. Now, suddenly, American bombers were approaching at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, and the gunners were not prepared. Heavy anti-aircraft guns, effective against high-altitude targets, had difficulty depressing their barrels enough to engage low-flying aircraft. Fire control systems calibrated for high-altitude interception were useless. Lighter anti-aircraft weapons, effective at lower altitudes, were positioned and coordinated for different approach patterns. The result was sporadic, poorly aimed defensive fire that achieved little. At approximately 15 minutes past midnight, Guam time, on March 10, 1945, the main bomber waves began arriving over Tokyo. For the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, B-29 seconds streamed over the city in steady succession, each aircraft releasing its load of incendiaries over the marked target area. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The M69 bomblets punched through thin roofing material or struck the ground and ignited seconds later, each one spraying a jet of flaming napalm. The M47s ignited on impact. Within minutes, hundreds of individual fires had started across the target area. The strong winds gusting across Tokyo fanned the flames and carried embers to neighboring structures. Tokyo's built environment made it uniquely vulnerable to fire. Unlike European cities constructed primarily of stone, brick, and concrete, Tokyo consisted overwhelmingly of wooden buildings with paper screens and highly flammable tatami mat floors. Structures were built close together, separated by narrow streets and alleys. Many homes had paper roofs. Even larger commercial and industrial buildings incorporated significant amounts of wood in their construction. American planners had consulted maps produced by the Office of Strategic Services that ranked Tokyo's wards by fire susceptibility. The Shitamachi district had been specifically selected because it represented the highest concentration of small workshops and cottage industries essential to Japanese war production, all surrounded by densely packed wooden residences. As more bombers arrived and dropped their loads, the individual fires began to merge. Within the first 2 hours, rapidly spreading conflagrations had overwhelmed Tokyo's firefighting capabilities. The city's fire department, already undermanned due to military conscription, faced an impossible situation. Fires were erupting simultaneously across a 16-square-mile area. Water mains ruptured from bomb damage and the heat. Firefighters attempting to reach blazes found streets blocked by debris and panicked civilians. The strong winds created conditions approaching a true firestorm. As fires consumed oxygen, they created powerful updrafts that drew in more air from surrounding areas, feeding the flames and spreading the destruction. Temperatures in the heart of the conflagration exceeded 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat was so intense that canals and rivers began to boil. Water reservoirs that civilians fled to for safety became death traps as the water heated to scalding temperatures. American bomber crews, flying through the smoke and flames, witnessed scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Staff Sergeant Henry Huglin, a tail gunner, later described looking down and seeing the whole city of Tokyo below me on fire and glowing like a bed of coals. The heat from the fires created severe turbulence that buffeted the bombers, some aircraft experiencing updrafts exceeding 5,000 feet per minute. Several crews reported being flipped partially inverted by the extreme turbulence. The smell penetrated the aircraft despite the altitude. Multiple crew members reported the unmistakable odor of burning flesh entering their B-29 seconds, forcing them to use oxygen masks, not for breathing, but to filter the smell. Some bombardiers and navigators, positioned in the aircraft's nose with the best view of the destruction below, became physically ill. 279 B-29 seconds successfully attacked Tokyo that night, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs. Another 19 superfortresses, unable to reach Tokyo due to mechanical problems or pilot decisions to abort, struck targets of opportunity elsewhere. The raid lasted approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. When the last bomber departed and dawn broke over Tokyo on March 10th, the extent of the destruction became apparent. Approximately 15.8 square miles of the city had been completely destroyed, representing 7% of Tokyo's total urban area. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department conducted surveys and estimated that 83,793 people had been killed. Another 40,918 were injured. Over 1 million people lost their homes. Post-war analysis by American and Japanese researchers suggested the death toll may have been even higher, with estimates ranging between 80,000 and 100,000 dead. The Operation Meeting House raid on Tokyo was the single deadliest air attack in human history, causing more deaths than either the atomic bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, more than the firebombing of Dresden, more than any other air raid conducted during the Second World War. For Japanese civilians who survived, the experience was apocalyptic. Families huddled in bomb shelters suffocated as fires consumed all oxygen in the surrounding area. People who fled into the streets were caught in firestorms and burned alive. Those who reached canals and rivers found the water itself on fire from burning oil and debris. Survivors described scenes of mothers carrying dead children, of people whose clothing had been burned away, of entire neighborhoods vanished in flames. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The immediate military impact was profound. Japanese war production in Tokyo suffered massive disruption. Over 250 factories involved in war production were destroyed or severely damaged. Thousands of skilled workers were killed or displaced. The infrastructure supporting manufacturing, electrical power, water supply, transportation networks was devastated. But the strategic impact extended far beyond the physical destruction in Tokyo. LeMay had demonstrated a new form of strategic bombing that Japanese defenses were completely unable to counter. Within days, he ordered additional large-scale incendiary raids against other major Japanese cities. On March 11, 1945, 285 B-29 seconds attacked Nagoya, dropping 1,900 tons of incendiaries and destroying 2 square miles of the city. On March 13th, 274 bombers hit Osaka with 1,700 tons of incendiaries, destroying 8 square miles. On March 16th, 307 B-29 seconds struck Kobe with 2,300 tons of incendiaries, destroying 3 square miles. In this 10-day period, beginning March 9th, 21st Bomber Command flew 1,595 sorties against 4 major Japanese cities, dropping 9,365 tons of incendiaries from an average altitude of 7,000 feet. 32 square miles of highly populated and industrialized areas were destroyed. American losses were remarkably light. Only 14 B-29 seconds were lost to enemy action across all these raids, a loss rate of less than 1%. The phenomenal success of the new tactics transformed morale within 21st Bomber Command. Crews who had been frustrated by months of ineffective high-altitude precision bombing now saw dramatic, undeniable results from every mission. The Japanese civilian population, by contrast, experienced growing terror and despair. Air raid sirens became a constant feature of daily life. Cities across Japan began conducting mass evacuations, with civilians fleeing to rural areas. Factory production plummeted as workers spent more time in shelters than at their workstations. The Japanese military leadership faced a crisis. They understood that American strategic bombing was systematically destroying Japan's capacity to continue the war, and they possessed no effective countermeasures. Attempts to reinforce air defenses proved futile. Even when Japanese fighters managed to intercept the low-flying bomber formations, which was rare, the reduced altitude made the B-29 seconds more dangerous rather than less. At 7,000 feet, the bombers flew faster and more maneuverable than at Kamet, 30,000 feet. Their defensive armament remained lethal. Japanese pilots attempting attacks still faced devastating defensive fire. Some units continued employing ramming tactics out of sheer desperation. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi's 244th Sentai achieved several claimed ramming kills. Other interceptor units reported similar tactics, but ramming a B-29, even if successful, resulted in the loss of both the bomber and the fighter. Japan was losing precious aircraft and irreplaceable experienced pilots in exchange for relatively modest reductions in American bomber numbers. The fundamental problem was mathematical. By mid-1945, 21st Bomber Command in the Marianas had grown to 5 bomb wings with nearly 1,000 B-29 seconds. Even if Japanese fighters achieved a spectacular 5% loss rate on every mission, which they never did, LeMay could sustain that attrition indefinitely while continuing to destroy Japanese cities at an accelerating pace. Japan's fighter production, disrupted by the very bombing it was trying to stop, could not replace losses quickly enough. Through the spring and summer of 1945, the bombing campaign continued with relentless intensity. By July, 21st Bomber Command was conducting raids with over 800 bombers, dropping more than 43,000 tons of bombs in a single month. Every major Japanese city was systematically targeted and burned. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, Kawasaki, and dozens of smaller cities suffered the same fate as Tokyo. The 20th Air Force began a psychological warfare campaign in conjunction with the bombing. B-29 seconds dropped leaflets over Japanese cities, warning civilians that their city would be bombed in the coming days and urging them to evacuate. 6 of 11 cities warned on July 27th were indeed attacked on July 28th. The leaflet drops served multiple purposes. They lowered civilian morale by forcing Japanese to recognize that American bombers could attack at will. They demonstrated American confidence and capability. They increased the humanitarian justification for the bombing by providing warning, though Japanese government officials prohibited civilians from keeping the leaflets under harsh penalties. By August 1945, 21st Bomber Command had achieved near-total air supremacy over Japan. On August 1st, 836 B-29 seconds staged the largest single raid of the Second World War, dropping 6,145 tons of bombs and mines. Japanese fighter opposition had dwindled to almost nothing. Most missions encountered no enemy aircraft at all. The few Japanese fighters that did attempt interceptions were quickly shot down or driven off. The bombing campaign's effectiveness could be measured in stark statistics. From the Marianas bases alone, B-29 seconds dropped approximately 160,000 tons of bombs on Japan between November 1944 and August 1945. The earlier China-based operations had added roughly 800 tons. In total, approximately 160,000 tons of high explosive and incendiary ordnance fell on Japanese cities and industrial targets in less than 10 months. The human cost was staggering. Between 241,000 and 900,000 Japanese civilians died in the air raids, with the wide range reflecting the difficulty of accurate casualty assessment amid such widespread destruction. Over 250,000 more were injured. Millions lost their homes. 66 major cities suffered significant damage. Industrial production collapsed as factories were destroyed, workers killed or displaced, and supply chains severed. By August 1945, Japanese leaders faced an impossible situation. The nation retained more than 2.5 million combat-equipped troops in the home islands and possessed approximately 9,000 kamikaze aircraft held in reserve for the expected American invasion. But the capacity to feed, supply, and sustain those forces was rapidly disintegrating. American bombers had wrecked Japan's economy, destroyed its industrial capacity, and shattered civilian morale. President Harry Truman issued the Potsdam Declaration on July 26, 1945, calling for Japan's unconditional surrender. Many in the Japanese government wanted to accept, recognizing that continued resistance was futile. 3 members of the cabinet objected, primarily because the declaration placed the emperor's fate in question. The internal debate continued for weeks while American bombing intensified. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion killed approximately 70,000 people immediately and would ultimately claim over 140,000 lives through radiation effects. On August 9th, another B-29 Bockscar dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 immediately and over 70,000 eventually. These atomic attacks, as devastating as they were, represented the culmination of a strategic bombing campaign that had already brought Japan to the brink of collapse. The atomic bombs provided the final shock that broke the deadlock in the Japanese cabinet. Emperor Hirohito intervened personally, breaking a 3-3 tie vote and ordering acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. In his unprecedented radio address to the Japanese people on August 15, 1945, announcing the surrender, the emperor specifically referenced the atomic bomb as justification, referring to a new and most cruel bomb whose power was incalculable. But post-war interrogations of Japanese leaders by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey revealed a more complex picture. Many Japanese officials stated that they had reached the conclusion that the war was unwinnable weeks or even months before the atomic bombs fell. The cumulative effect of the conventional bombing campaign had destroyed Japan's capacity to continue fighting. The atomic bombs provided political cover for surrender, allowing leaders to claim they were yielding to an unprecedented weapon rather than admitting they had simply been defeated by overwhelming conventional force. On September 2, 1945, Japanese officials stood on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay to sign the formal instruments of surrender. As they signed, a large formation of Boeing B-29 Superfortress heavy bombers flew low over the bay in a demonstration flight, a final reminder of the terrible destruction that had befallen their nation. The bombers that Japanese pilots had initially mocked and underestimated had turned Japan's cities into ruins. The confidence that Japanese fighters would sweep silver giants from the sky had proven catastrophically misplaced. The technological gap between the B-29 and Japanese air defenses had been far wider than anyone in the Japanese military initially comprehended. The statistics told the story of that mismatch. B-29 gunners were credited with destroying 714 Japanese aircraft, probably destroying 456 more, and damaging 770. From the beginning of combat operations on November 24, 1944 to August 14, 1945, the 20th Air Force operating from the Marianas lost 447 B-29 seconds total. Of these, only 343 aircraft, representing 1.2% of those airborne, were lost to enemy action in combat missions. The remaining losses were due to mechanical failures, accidents, and other non-combat causes. Japanese fighters accounted for only 13% of all battle damage inflicted on B-29 seconds. 76% of damage came from anti-aircraft fire. 9% was attributed to both fighters and flak. 2% was self-inflicted, typically from aircraft in formation accidentally striking each other with defensive fire. During the entire campaign, 11% of aircraft over targets were lost or damaged, but the vast majority returned to base and flew again. For Japanese fighter pilots, these statistics represented a bitter truth. Despite extraordinary bravery, despite innovative tactics including ramming attacks, despite the sacrifice of hundreds of pilots and aircraft, they had failed to significantly impede the American bombing campaign. The B-29 had proven effectively unstoppable, given the technology and resources available to Japanese defenders. The strategic lessons were profound and would shape military aviation for decades. The B-29 campaign demonstrated that technological superiority in strategic bombing could achieve decisive results even against a determined enemy willing to fight to the death. It proved that disruption of an enemy's economy and industrial capacity could force surrender even while substantial military forces remained in the field. It showed that command of the air, once established, could be exploited to devastating effect, but the campaign also raised troubling moral questions that remain debated to this day. The transition from precision bombing of military and industrial targets to area bombing of cities deliberately blurred the line between combatants and civilians. The firebombing raids were designed to kill civilian workers and destroy the homes of families employed in war production. The death toll among non-combatants was immense. Defenders of the bombing campaign argue that it shortened the war and ultimately saved lives by making an invasion of the Japanese home islands unnecessary. Estimated American casualties for such an invasion ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. Japanese casualties, both military and civilian, would have been far higher. The atomic bombs and conventional bombing campaign together convinced Japanese leaders that continued resistance was futile, achieving surrender without the need for the planned invasions. Critics contend that the systematic destruction of Japanese cities, particularly the incendiary raids deliberately designed to cause firestorms in residential areas, constituted war crimes under international law. They argue that Japan was already defeated by mid-1945, with its navy destroyed, its merchant fleet sunk, its cities blockaded, and its economy collapsing. Surrender was inevitable, regardless of the bombing campaign's final months. These debates continue among historians and legal scholars. What is indisputable is the enormous human cost on both sides, and the transformation of warfare that the B-29 campaign represented. Strategic bombing had evolved from a theoretical doctrine to a war-winning capability. The bomber, once derided by skeptics who believed fighters would always shoot them down, had proven capable of achieving strategic objectives that previously required massive ground invasions. For the aircrews who flew the missions, the experience left profound marks. Many struggled with what they had witnessed and participated in. Tail gunner Henry Huglin's description of watching Tokyo burn like a bed of coals was echoed by hundreds of crew members who saw cities destroyed beneath them. Radio operator Richard Barthold, who had flown through the smoke of Operation Meeting House, carried those memories for decades. Yet the crews also recognized they had accomplished something militarily significant. They had broken the back of Japanese war production. They had forced the surrender of an empire that had vowed to fight to the last civilian. They had ended a war that had claimed millions of lives across the Pacific and Asia. Whatever moral complexity surrounded the campaign, its effectiveness was undeniable. For Japanese civilians who survived the bombing, the trauma lasted generations. Survivors of the Tokyo firebombing, known as hibakusha in Japanese alongside atomic bomb survivors, carried physical and psychological scars for life. Entire families had been wiped out. Neighborhoods that had existed for centuries vanished in single nights. The cultural and historical heritage destroyed in the fires was incalculable. The confidence with which Japanese military leaders had initially viewed the B-29 threat stands as one of the war's great miscalculations. When reconnaissance photographs first showed American construction activity in the Marianas in the fall of 1944, Japanese intelligence understood that B-29 seconds were coming, but they believed their fighters would prove effective. They trusted their pilots' skill and courage. They assumed the lessons learned fighting American aircraft in China and the Pacific would apply. They were wrong. The B-29 represented a quantum leap in capability that rendered existing air defense doctrine obsolete. The bomber's combination of altitude, speed, range, payload, and defensive armament created a weapons system that Japanese technology could not effectively counter. The handful of Japanese fighters capable of reaching the B-29's operating altitude lacked the firepower to inflict rapid kills. The fighters with adequate armament could not reach the altitude. The pilots who possessed the skill to execute difficult interception tactics often flew inadequate aircraft. Even when American tactics shifted to low-altitude night attacks, Japanese defenses failed to adapt effectively. Night fighter capabilities remained primitive. Searchlight and anti-aircraft gun coordination was poor. Ground-based radar coverage was insufficient. The very speed with which LeMay implemented the tactical shift left Japanese defenders unable to respond. The irony was sharp. Japanese propaganda had promised the people that the homeland would be defended, that enemy bombers would be shot down, that the divine wind would protect the sacred islands. Instead, American bombers ranged freely across Japanese skies, destroying cities methodically and systematically, while Japanese fighters proved unable to stop them. The mockery and confidence that some Japanese pilots initially expressed about the B-29 threat transformed into grim recognition of their own helplessness. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress ended the Second World War in the Pacific. Not alone, certainly. Ground forces had captured the islands from which the bombers operated. Naval forces had destroyed the Japanese fleet and blockaded the home islands. Intelligence services had broken Japanese codes. Diplomatic pressure had isolated Japan internationally, but it was the B-29 that delivered the crushing blows that made continued Japanese resistance untenable. From 30,000 feet, or from 7,000 feet flying through smoke and fire, American bomber crews had prosecuted a campaign that destroyed Japanese cities and broke Japanese morale. They had proven that strategic bombing could achieve what ground invasion would have required at catastrophic cost in lives. They had demonstrated American industrial and technological superiority in the most dramatic way possible. They had forced the surrender of an empire. The silver bombers that Japanese pilots had once believed they could shoot down instead rained fire from the sky, dropping approximately 160,000 tons of destruction across 9 months, turning 66 cities into smoking ruins, killing hundreds of thousands, and forcing an emperor to speak publicly for the first time in history to announce his nation's defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.